My message today is more of a Bible study than a sermon because I want to talk about the book of Hebrews. Sometimes you may wonder why I give certain sermon topics. The answer is sometimes because I want to talk about it. And that happens to be the case today. It's on my mind. There are some things here that I thought might be worth discussing with you. I want you to turn to Hebrews 3 because of some things that we will see here. I'm not going to do a complete Hebrews today. I've done that before in a radio program. Paul writes to the Hebrews, and I believe it probably was Paul. I've gone around in circles on my opinion about the author of Hebrews, but we'll assume for the sake of argument it was Paul. He said, "Wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Jesus Christ." Now, this last clause, I think, can almost be taken as the theme of the book of Hebrews. Consider Jesus Christ. Because that is what he asks us to do almost from the get-go in the book of Hebrews. From chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, all the way down through 7 and 8 and beyond. The thing that we are asked to do is to think about Jesus Christ, to consider him. The book, in a sense, the book of Hebrews is probably one of the most important books in the Bible for establishing our Christology. That is, our theology of Christ, our view of Christ, who he is, what he is, where he fits in the overall picture of God's plan. Between the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Hebrews, you can develop, in the book of Hebrews, you can develop a very high level of Christology and understanding of Jesus. Hebrews tackles the subject from several angles. "Wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Christ Jesus, who was faithful to him that appointed him, as Moses was faithful in all his house. For this man was counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as he who built the house is greater or has more honor than the house. For every house is built by some man, but he who built everything is God." What's his point? His point is that Christ is greater than Moses. Now, this is a crucial point for Jewish converts in the church. And the church was, of course, it was almost entirely Jewish to start with, and even at this late date, which was probably in the early 60s A.D. when Hebrews was written, the church is still very much dominated by Jewish members of the church. And a crucial situation for them is their understanding of the relationship of Moses to the church and Christ to Moses. Well, he sets the record straight very quickly. Christ is greater than Moses. It's a crucial point for these Jewish converts, and I think it was a point that was probably hotly in dispute at times. We know all the way back in Acts 15 that there was a major dispute over certain questions having to do with circumcision and the law of Moses. More than just merely the law of Moses, but really the administration of Moses. And this is a point that is lost on many Christian readers. They don't understand the principle of an administration. I'll come back to that. Now, Hebrews has already established that Christ is greater than the angels. He started off with that theme to make the point that Jesus Christ is no mere angel. He is a son, with all that implies. He is greater than the angels, and now he comes along to Jewish converts and says he is also greater than Moses. He is the Son of God and heir of everything. Then in verse 5 he says this, "Moses verily was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken after. But Christ as a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of hope firm to the end." Now, I'm going to take you through momentarily here an illustration of how easy it is to read over things and not quite understand or not realize what someone has just said to you. The King James translators, in this particular case, have taken a liberty with these two verses. The NIV translators took an even greater liberty. I don't know which particular Bible you have open on your lap. But here is basically what we were talking about. I have to assume that they saw this passage differently in its implications. Here's what the NIV says. Listen carefully. "Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, testifying to what would be said in the future. But Christ is faithful as a son over God's house, and we are his house if we hold on to our courage and the hope of which we boast." King James, that's the NIV. King James Version. "Moses was verily faithful in all his house as a servant for the testimony of those things which were to be spoken after. But Christ as a servant over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm to the end." Did you catch the difference? God's house, or his house, and whether or not that difference is significant. Now, the Greek word for God is not found in this verse as the NIV has it. There is no theos there. There is no word God there at all. Neither is the reflexive his own house that you find in the King James Version. In both cases, it's just simply Moses of his house, Christ of his house, is the way the writer of Hebrews laid this out for us. But the King James translators saw a distinction being made. The NIV translators saw no distinction made. And I think they do a disservice to their readers when they decide for you how you're supposed to understand this particular passage. Because that's what they have done. The NIV people want you to understand that what we're dealing with is one house. It's God's house. Moses was over it. Now Christ is over it. The King James Version, however, sees, their translators saw, that there was a distinction, a contrast between the house of Moses and the house of Christ, and they pointed it out by using the reflexive, which is not in the Greek, his own house. Now, who's right? And what should it be? The term house of is used in the Bible to refer to a government or a governing family as a general rule. For example, the Bible would speak of the house of Saul and the house of David. Both of them ruled over Israel, right? But they were different in the sense that both of them had different administrations. They were different families as well, ruling dynasties. And so the house of Saul is one government. The house of David is another government. They both governed Israel, but the governmental structure was Saul's in one case and David's in another. Solomon, who followed David, was still of the house of David because he was David's son. And so consequently, the administration carried on through, but it became Solomon's administration of David's house. Later, we will see a house of Israel and a house of Judah, once again making a distinction between two particular governmental structures. Now, what's at issue here? What I think is at issue here is whether the Christian faith is Judaism 2 or Judaism light, or whether it is something entirely different from Judaism. Now, if you've been around me or heard me very much before, you realize that I do not consider the religion of Moses and Abraham to be Judaism. Many writers, in fact, I think probably most writers about the Bible do assume that. But Judaism is a late arrival on the scene. I make a distinction between Judaism, which is the religion of the Jews following the Babylonian captivity, which was their response to the revelation of God, and it's to be respected as such, and the religion of Moses and Abraham, which perhaps better would be called Yahvism, or that is the worship of Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament. Judaism is the particular Jewish version of that. We need to understand that in the early church, there was very strong opinion and held in some quarters that Christianity was merely a new and improved Judaism. And in some cases, they didn't think it's very much improved. But that's what many people thought of the Christian faith early. Acts 15, which I won't go into today, is clear testimony to the fact that the Pharisees lost that round. Those forces in the church that wanted the church to be seen as nothing more than an extension of Moses' administration. The law of Moses, that is the administration of Moses, the law administered the way Moses would administer it, was not going to be the way the church was going to be administered. This was a distinction that was made. It was a decision that was arrived at by the church. It was challenged early on. And the fact of the matter is that that party that wanted to maintain a Mosaic influence in the early church was very persistent over the years, even following the Jerusalem conference. And it was a battle that Paul had to fight again and again. One of the things we keep running up against in the church is people assume that because we keep the Sabbath and the holy days that we're somehow Judaistic or think in terms of Judaism or influenced in that direction. That's not the case. We keep the Sabbath and the holy days because they are a part of the law of God, not because they are a part of the administration of Moses. And the early church had to deal with this, and I have a feeling that the writer of Hebrews understood this, and it is what he is driving at in these verses. I think the King James translators were true to what he was saying, even though they took liberties which I think probably are unwarranted on the part of translators. What is the writer of Hebrews trying to say, and who had him right? We'll come back to Hebrews in a moment, but I want to consider a couple of references before we continue. One of them is Matthew 16, verse 15. Now, what's happened here is that Jesus has called his disciples over. He says, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And they had all kinds of things to say. Simon Peter answered, and when once they had given them the answers of what people said, he said, "Okay, who do you say that I am?" Matthew 16, verse 15. Verse 16, Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed it to you, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say unto you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Now, I do read a little bit of Greek. And when you look at this particular thing, "I will build" is future tense, and it talks about something that is going to be done after the date at which it is spoken. Jesus does not say he is going to remodel his church. He doesn't say he is going to take over an existing church. He says, "I will build my assembly," which is, of course, what the Greek word here means. And that's another interesting discussion, which we again won't go into today. So, once again, Jesus does not say, "I'm going to remodel Judaism. I'm going to take Judaism to a new and improved level. I will build my church," which the wording says in Greek, the Greek reader would say, we got something new coming down the pike. Now, consider that. Now, Ephesians chapter 2, the other scripture I want to go to, is Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19. Paul has been at some pains here describing the problem of the divisions that exist between Jews and Christians and Jews and Gentiles in the church. I mean, it's just a continuing, ongoing problem. It's a frustration to him, and I know a frustration to the church, and he keeps attacking it from different directions. Finally, he says, "Now therefore you Gentiles are no more strangers and foreigners. You are fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God, and you are built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building, fitly framed together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord." Do you see anything significant there? Look at what he says. "You are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ being the chief cornerstone." Who's missing? Moses. Moses is not mentioned here. And I think that's very important, because if the assumption is made that you have this continuum that goes all the way from Moses down to throughout the entirety of the New Testament, Moses should be a part of the foundation of the New Testament church. The prophets are. But he says the apostles and the prophets. Now, Moses perhaps could be considered as one of the prophets, but that's not the point. The point is that if Moses were crucial, Moses would be mentioned, and Moses is not mentioned in this case. The New Testament church is not built on Moses. We observe many aspects of the law of God. In fact, I'm one who believes that not one jot nor one tittle has ever passed from the written law. It's all right there to challenge us, to make us think, to tell us the difference between right and wrong, to give us guidance, to give us understanding in the way we live our lives. Some aspects of it you cannot observe in the 20th century, but nevertheless they are still there. They have not been abolished. And what they tell you is how God responded to a given situation in a given time, what is right and what is wrong. It's important for us to know that. When the country elected George W. Bush as president, and Bill Clinton got in his airplane and flew off to New York, did the law of the land change? No. What did change? The administration changed. Now, we all understand this. If you watch very much of the news and try to follow politics at all, you understand what a change of administration means. Okay, Moses had an administration of the law of God. Along comes Jesus, and in the Sermon on the Mount, he begins to take over. And he says, "You have heard it said by them of old time, but I say unto you." What he is telling you is a new administration is coming into town. We are not going to do this Moses way anymore. The law of God is still there. We will still obey the law of God. And indeed, as I think amply demonstrated, the entire Christian church throughout the entire period of time when the New Testament was being written still observed the Sabbath and still observed the holy days. Never changed in all the time that the New Testament was being written. So any changes had to come after that. Now, and considering all of that, since the law didn't change, what did? The administration. That is very simply what we're talking about here. The church is not then the house of Moses. The church is the house of Christ. And I think when I read this, I'm pretty sure that the King James translators got the right angle on this one. Moses over his house was faithful, but Jesus is a son over his own house. And it's not the same administration. Now, one of the reasons why I felt it was important to make this point to everybody is because of the fact that we are attentive to the law of God. because of the fact we keep the Sabbath, because of the fact that we keep the holy days, because we don't eat unclean meats and so forth. There is a tendency on many parts to assume that our ethics, our structure, our doctrine, our beliefs are informed by Judaism. That is not true. They are informed by Christ. The law of God as interpreted, as administered by Christ for the church. Therefore, things that come out of the Jewish culture are for Jews. And people who, like us, who are not Jews, who attempt to adapt them, only wind up making ourselves look silly. And I've seen some examples of that, that I won't bother describing for you. But nevertheless, that's not what we are supposed to do. We are not called upon to follow Jewish custom. We're not called upon to follow Jewish culture. Our job is to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ and to think carefully about the law of God and use it as a guide to right and wrong in our lives every day. So now, having established that, we can return to the book of Hebrews and talk about what we find here. Wherefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you will hear his voice, don't harden your hearts as in the provocation in the day of temptation in the wilderness. Don't make that mistake. When your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works for 40 years, I was grieved with that generation and said, they do always err in their heart. They have not known my ways. These people who stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, who heard the law of God rumbling down that, who probably in many cases had their bowels loosened as a result of standing there listening to the power of that voice, who backed off, stood back, and the whole mountain smoked with the sound of God's voice. These people heard God himself testify to them, and his testimony was the Ten Commandments. They are, by the way, called the testimony of God, and the ark was originally called the Ark of the Testimony because the testimony of God was in it. The Ten Commandments were the testimony of God. God held up his right hand, as it were, and swore to them, and he gave him his testimony, the Ten Commandments. He said they didn't get it. They hadn't got away from the mountain to where they began to lose it. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. And the writer of Hebrews here does a curious thing as he begins to develop his theme there, because this idea of the rest of God is hardly developed anywhere else in the Bible at all, but it becomes evident as you go along that what he's talking about is the entry into the promised land, crossing Jordan, going into the promised land and into the kingdom. A lot of modern hymn writers would equate it perhaps with going to heaven. And in fact, a lot of old hymn writers used to equate crossing Jordan with going to heaven, whereas Jordan was the boundary between this life and the next life. The promised land is heaven. The promised land, Canaan, is a type of heaven. And I'm bound for Canaan's happy land means I'm going to heaven. The whole hymn, the whole symbolism of the hymns in this regard is that the Canaan, the promised land, the rest of God, is going to be the millennium, the kingdom of God, the going to heaven, however you want to put it. So somehow and typologically, the rest of God comes into play in here as his way of talking about coming into the land, being at rest and at peace in the land, and so forth. And it's a curious expression because you go through there, the Greek word that is used for rest here is kataposis, and it means basically just rest. It's very simple. It's used, I forget now, I'd counted it once upon a time, but I've forgotten again and again through this whole section. Every time he uses the word rest except one, that's the word he uses. And when we come to that other one, we'll talk about that because it is singular and of singular importance. Now take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Now, this is a call that goes out to every one of us sitting here today to exhort one another daily while it's called today. In other words, don't plan on doing this tomorrow. You better do it right now. Because what's going on around us is that you and I are being hardened daily through the deceitfulness of sin. We are getting used to sin every day. We are becoming accustomed to it. We are getting to where we will accept it. Our reaction to sin in our environment and society around us is not nearly as violent as it might have been 30 years ago, 40 years ago, or 50 years ago. We are being inured to sin day after day after day, being callous to it, and coming to the place to where we will accept it. It really is something that we don't even blink at anymore to learn that a couple of people that we're working with at work are shacked up. They're living together. They moved in together. People will freely now talk about it. There was a time when people who shacked up never talked about it. Now they have no problem. They'll come to your work and say, oh, yeah, I moved in with my boyfriend yesterday. Yes, I'd like to rent your house. We're going to have a baby. Are you married? Oh, no, we're not married. But we are going to move in together. And they already have a baby. And they don't think anything about telling you this anymore. Why don't they think that? Because we are being hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. It's very deceitful. The whole thing is designed to get you to accept, and if you watch television, it is almost like somebody sat down and made a program and planned out a whole system for generations to try to inure us to certain types to get us to accept certain types of irrational, perverted conduct, if I may, as being normal and natural. And we should not discriminate against people on the basis of what they do. It's an interesting thing. Television did accomplish, some years back, some very useful things regarding civil rights, regarding discrimination against races, and so forth. I have often felt Norman Lear probably did more to affect changes in people's attitude toward race in here than the Civil Rights Bill ever did, because of some of the programs he made which caused people to look at black people and the relationship between black people and white people in ways they had never looked at before. This is one of the illustrations of the power of television, of entertainment, of movies, and so forth, to change mores, to change standards, to change the way we look at the world. And it can be a power for good, but it can also be a power for evil. And it doesn't take a lot of looking around this world today to figure out precisely what's going on. Parents nowadays are finding one of the chief complaints of parents these days is the difficulty they have in overcoming the current culture in our country and the morality of our culture where their children are concerned. And they're very concerned about the direction the popular culture, I think is the term for it, is taking us. They can't deal with it because it is so strong at school. It's so strong in the movies. It's so strong in television. You've almost got to take your kids and head for Wyoming or Montana or someplace out in the wilderness and cut off all the excess of media to coming back in, if you want to keep your children from imbibing of the popular culture today. It's just too all-pervasive. And we are being hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we are made partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. Boy, what a statement that is. It seems obvious, doesn't it? But look at that again. We are made partakers of Christ if, and it's a very strong belief out there that among a lot of Christian people that there's no if about it. That once you have come to Christ, once you've accepted Christ, once you've been baptized, once you're, become a Christian, you're there for life. Its doctrine is often referred to as once saved, always saved, or the security of the believer. What Paul says here is we are made partakers of Christ if we hold fast our beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. It isn't good enough to start well, according to him. You've got to end well as well. Now, I suppose people have got ways of explaining this verse, but it seems to me the intent of the writer is clear. It's good that you started out, but you're going to have to hold on to this to the end, and the popular culture is going to do everything in its power to take it away from you. While it is said today, what does that mean? It means not tomorrow. It means today. If you will hear his voice, don't harden your heart as in the provocation. For some, when they heard, did provoke, how we had not everyone that came out of Egypt by Moses. But with whom was he grieved for 40 years? Was it with those who sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness, and to whom he sware that they should not enter into his rest, but to them who believe not? So we see they could not enter in because of unbelief. Now that's interesting all by itself. They couldn't enter in because of unbelief. And the strongest manifestation of this unbelief was after all these people had been through, they had walked dry-shod across the bottom of the Red Sea. They had followed a column of fire by day and a column of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by daytime. They had seen all the things. They'd stood there when they had no water and everybody were dying of thirst. They saw Moses hit a rock and water come rolling out of that thing like anything they'd ever seen before. They had seen miracle after miracle after miracle, suffered plagues and all kinds of stuff. And then when the time came, and they sent the spies into the land, and the spies came back and told them, we were like grasshoppers in the sight of these people. They are bigger than we are. We can't do it. Two men, Joshua and Caleb, said, yes, we can. Let's go in. We are well able to overcome them. We can do it. And the people who should have known that God would be with them who, even if they didn't believe that they themselves, being grasshoppers in the sight of all these giants in the land, could possibly make it, they should have by this time believed God. But they didn't. They didn't believe what he told them he would do. And this is where you and I come up against it sometimes in our lives today. Do we really believe what he says or not? We say we do, but when it comes decision time, do we really believe? Or, like those people, are we afraid to stick our neck out? Are we afraid to take a chance? We're afraid to go forward with God. We'll back off. We'll compromise with whatever it is that we're doing instead of standing firm for what is right. Well, they didn't believe, and they couldn't enter. Now, it's also apparent, as you read this right here, that what he is talking about is crossing Jordan and entering the land. Now, I realize some of them have got property on the other side of Jordan, but the metaphor still stands. Jordan is the boundary. The promised land is Palestine. He promised it to them. He was going to give them to them. And that's what he's talking about when he talks about Israel and entering into his rest. Now, he's looking beyond this, and the reason I think he chooses the term rest to describe this is because that entering into the promised land is symbolic of something else. It is symbolic of something out there in the future that we still have to look forward to and still have to come to. But initially, here, that's what we're talking about. We're going to come to the Jordan. We're going to walk out into that Jordan holding the Ark of God, and the river's going to stop. And we're going to be able to walk dry-shod across the Jordan River. We're going to build a monument out there, in fact, of stones in the middle of the Jordan where we crossed it on that occasion. And, when the Ark stood there and the water stopped and we walked dry-shod and we entered into the promised land, Canaan, God's rest, and that type of the kingdom of God. Now, Hebrews 4 begins to go a little further with this theme and develops some really interesting sidelights to it. He said, "Therefore let us fear, lest a promise being left to us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it." Now, I don't see how the metaphor, the typology, the symbolism of this could be missed. You know, Egypt is a type of sin. Coming out of Egypt is a type of sin. Going under the Red Sea was a kind of baptism. So the metaphor for the Christian life is clear. You know, we're liberated from sin. We're baptized by going through the Red Sea. We wander out in the wilderness for a while, and we come to the time when we might enter God's land. And what he's saying here is, now having gone through all this, and having come right to the border of it, fear lest you should come short of it. And there is absolutely no reason for him to tell you this unless it is possible for you to come short of it, is it? And so consequently, it does behoove us to sit up and take notice of what God tells us in this regard, that unbelief, that hesitance in obedience to him, allowing the world to harden us through the deceitfulness of sin, allowing ourselves to be dragged along with the popular culture. If we're going to let that happen to us, we could easily find ourselves coming short of the Jordan River. Unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them. But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith with them that heard it. You can tell them, but if they don't believe it, it isn't going to do them a bit of good. We who have believed do enter into rest, as he said. I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. It's a little muddy in this, the translation is, but it's almost as though saying, I made all this ready from the foundation of the world. I intended this thing right from the very beginning. I had it all in mind and had it all prepared, and I'm working for it so you can be there. And through unbelief, even though it was prepared for the foundation of the world, you won't be there. That's what he's saying. Now, I'm not just telling you this to frighten you, but if fright is necessary to get us to think about it, then perhaps that's the best thing to do. For he spoke at a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his works. Now, we all understand what that's talking about. We go back to creation, where God, created the earth in 6 days. We know about all the sequence of events and the things that he did, and finally, when it came to the seventh day, God rested on the seventh day. And the Bible, interestingly, tells us in one place that he rested and was refreshed. It's kind of hard to think of God being refreshed, isn't it? I mean, this impassible God who cannot be touched and cannot be changed and who never tires and never gets weary and so forth. And yet here he says he rested and was refreshed. So we know what he's talking about here when he says in a certain day it spoke of the seventh day. We're all in clear on that. That's the seventh day which God blessed and sanctified, which means to sanctify something means to make it holy. When did he do that? Creation. We all know that. And in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest, and the idea of that seems to be they shall not enter into my rest. Seeing then, therefore, it remains that somebody has got to go in. And those to whom it was preached could not enter because of unbelief. He almost leaves that as an elliptical expression, doesn't it? It kind of hangs out there. Seeing that it remains that some must enter, and they to whom it was not preached cannot enter. Ellipsis. What? Does anything come to your mind from the teachings of Jesus on this? Remember the wedding feast that was made ready? And the invitations were all sent out, and everybody began to make excuses. And finally he says, not one of those people who were bidden are going to taste of this feast. Go out into the highways and byways and find somebody else and bring somebody else in here. We are going to have a wedding feast. And that's almost the same theme that's being developed here. There were a group of people headed for this rest. They were cut off from this rest. But somebody has got to be brought in to take their place. Again, he limits a certain day, saying in David, today, after so long a time as it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Now, how many times is he going to get this theme through to us about not hardening our hearts? Being repeated as it is again and again, I have to consider that it is a very real danger that we have to deal with here. Don't do that. For if Jesus had given them rest, and this is really an interesting little passage here, because the impression is that if Joshua, which is what Joshua and Jesus is the same word, by the way, and I think probably, I don't have my NIV here, but probably NIV probably says Joshua there. Does anybody have one? Yeah, it does. If Joshua had given them rest, then he wouldn't have spoken afterward of another day. Now that's interesting, because what he now tells us is, okay, fine, Joshua took them to the Jordan. Joshua took, had the priests walk out with the ark into the Jordan. The river stopped. They went dry shod across the Jordan. Joshua took them into the promised land. If that was it, he would not have spoken afterward of another day. There remains, therefore, a rest to the people of God. Now, this is interesting because of all these uses of rest, and my memory serves, I think there are about 11 of them in this passage. All of them are kataposis except this one. This one is sabbatismos. And all of you recognize Sabbath as the Sabbath. The ismos ending in Greek basically is sort of like ing is in English. There remains, therefore, a Sabbathing to the people of God, or as I think one translation has it, a Sabbath keeping to the people of God. I think maybe NIV has a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So the recognition all of a sudden, there still remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For he that has entered into his rest, he has ceased from his own works as God did from his. Now, not that long ago, there was a lot made of this passage in Hebrews 4 about Christ being our Sabbath. In other words, that the rest of God, there was a convoluted argument made by somebody who was an ex-Seventh-day Adventist about all this section through here as to what it actually means. And how that Christ is the rest of God, and therefore Christ is our Sabbath, and therefore we do not keep a seventh-day Sabbath. But look at what this verse says. He that is entered into his rest has ceased from his own works as God did from his. Now that's pretty explicit. We're not talking here about ceasing from your bad works. We're not talking about here of stopping doing things you shouldn't be doing, because it says you are doing what God did. He has ceased from his own works as God did from his works. You work 6 days, you rest the seventh. I was on a visit once, many years ago, up in Arkansas with a family that happened on the same day to have 2 Jehovah's Witness ladies there at the same time. And just one of those things that happen occasionally. And we got to talking about the Sabbath. And she had her little pattern that she went through. Well, we keep every day holy to Jehovah God. And I said, really? When do you work? And she blinked. This was a question she had obviously never encountered in all of her visiting at homes. And she did not understand what I was talking about. I said, well, when do you work? She says, what do you mean? I said, well, the Sabbath day, the commandment on the Sabbath day says 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In the Sabbath you don't do any work. How can, if you keep every day holy to Jehovah God, when do you work? It wasn't very long. They excused themselves and left, and I don't really know if they ever returned to see that lady again, because it is an unanswerable question. to that, well, we keep every day holy Jehovah God. In that way, I said, fine, when do you work? And this is a question I think people have to deal with. Now, here he says this: he that has entered into his rest has ceased from his own work as God did from his. There remains, therefore, a Sabbath keeping or Sabbathing to the people of God. To me, this chapter is as clear as anything you'll ever find, that the Sabbath has not been abolished, the Sabbath is still being obeyed, and that we are doing it for the same reason God did. We are doing it because God did it. We are doing it in solidarity with God. And in fact, that's what the Ten Commandments tell us. That in 6 days get all your work done because God made the heavens and the earth in 6 days and rested the seventh day. We rest the Sabbath day in solidarity with God. This little verse, he that has entered into his rest has ceased from his own works as God did from his, drives a nail into the lid on this argument, I think, about the Sabbath day that is developed out of Hebrews 4, because you just can't go anywhere with this. Let us therefore labor to enter into his rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. For the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit and joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and the intents of the heart. What a statement. That book you hold in your lap out there, that Bible, that Word of God, which is what he's talking about here, is quick, and it's powerful, and it can basically slice and dice you, is what he's saying here, and cut you up into tiny little pieces. So believe, and don't let that hardness begin to creep in on you. Don't let yourself get swept up in the popular culture to the place to where you don't enter into God's rest, because it is by no means guaranteed. There is no creature that is not manifest in his sight. Everything is naked and open in the eyes of him with whom we have to do. It's kind of a sobering thought. There is no place you can hide. There is no place you can go and do things and he does not know it. And there's a curious thing about it. Someday you just stand, and when you're getting ready for the bath, stand in front of the mirror for a moment once you got all your clothes off and take a look at yourself. This is what God sees. It isn't the clothes. And in fact, he sees the bare you more even than that. What there is there to see of you, God sees. You can't hide it. I read once that someone was taking great exception with the Psalms, because some of the Psalms are pretty tough in the way they talk about people. And he kind of wondered whether it was really right for us to pray with that kind of vehemence about an enemy or somebody we were angry with or something. And I said to myself, maybe even said to him at the time, well, you might as well go ahead and pray about it, because God knows it. You might as well, if you hate the guy, you might as well tell God you hate the guy. If you really want him to have gravel in his teeth, you might as well tell God that's what you want, because God knows that's what you want for him. And I found myself one day, I was really angry with someone, and I was praying just this kind of prayer. And when I prayed the prayer, all of a sudden I found I couldn't pray that way. I wanted to. I was angry. But I found as I tried to say the words, all of a sudden I found myself in deep remorse over having tried to pray that way about the man. And just the other day I noticed something about David's Psalms that was kind of new to me. It was one of the early Psalms, it was 4 or 5. One of them that has to do with David when he's fleeing from Absalom, and so angry, so upset, so concerned about his enemies. And he does pray about God's judgment upon his enemies in very serious terms, but I suddenly noticed as I read the psalm, it dawned on me that David had not used anyone's name. What he said is, if a man is my enemy, he said, my enemies do this. The wicked do this to them. Those people who are lying do this to them. He talks to God about people who are doing things that are wrong, and he says, for the people who are doing these things, I forget exactly what it was, but break their kneecaps, put gravel in their teeth, do all the bad things you're going to do to them. But he didn't name any names. And I think it's an important thing to remember, because what that says to me is, I don't know those people's heart. I don't know what's going on inside of that man. It seems to me he's done me wrong. So what I will do is I will pray that God will chastise the man who is of a wrong spirit, who is doing evil things, in a generic way. and I will not name names. And David didn't, which I think is fascinating. Now, some of the prescripts to the Psalms do mention some names, like one of them mentions Doeg, another one mentions Absalom. But there's no way of knowing that those were, in fact, I think generally speaking, it is thought that these are not in the original Hebrew, that these came in as a later addition to the text as an explanation by some of the rabbis, perhaps. I think it's really important that we understand this, that everything is naked and open to the eyes of Him with whom we have to do. So whatever's on your mind in prayer, you might as well talk to God about it, because He already knows. For we have not a high priest who cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like we are, yet without sin. And all I've got to say regarding one doctrinal idea that was going around, that it was physically impossible for Jesus to commit sin, was if there was no way that He could have committed sin, then He was not tempted like I am. I mean, we have to go this life, we have to walk the tightrope of this life without a net. And that tells me that Jesus walked it without a net as well. He did get help, but He didn't get any help that's not available to you and I if we will ask for it, look for it, and trust God for it. Let us therefore come boldly before the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Really some powerful thoughts in this 3rd and 4th chapter of Hebrews, as he talks to us and says, consider Jesus Christ. I won't go further in the book today, but there is so much more in there along this same theme. Consider Jesus Christ and the significance of Jesus Christ in our Christian walk. He is our Lord. He is our Master. We are disciples in the school of Jesus. And we need to understand that He is our Master, not someone else. And it is His interpretation of the law, His administration, that we follow, and not someone else's.